Blessed Sunday, everyone. Hope you had a wonderful week. Let's continue with our series, The Bible, which PN started last week. Isn't it interesting that as we start the year 2023, we will be start dealing with the books of the Bible. And today, we will continue with Exodus, the second book of the Bible. It is one of the more important books to understand if you're going to understand the Bible. It is a pretty long book, but its structure is pretty straightforward. And that's what we're going to look at today. But before we dive into the story and the structure of Exodus, let's get a quick overview of some of the themes that we're going to see in Exodus. So Exodus shows us a lot about who God is. We're going to see His faithfulness, how God keeps His promises to His people. We're also going to learn about Israel's origin, and it's really their theological origins. Remember in Genesis, where PN discussed with us last week, we saw the ancestral origins of Israel, and we saw some of the promises that God made to the ancestors of the people of Israel. But now we're going to see Israel emerge as a nation. We're also going to see a little about God protecting His name and His reputation. He's a very powerful being in the Bible, the most powerful being in fact. And so, God really cares about how His people treat and respect Him, and also how God of the other nations and how the other nations interact with Him. So that's gonna be an interesting thing for us to see in the book of Exodus. Then we also have the law. Now the first 5 books of the Bible collectively called the law or the law of Moses. And Exodus give us the introduction of how Israel came to have a law that came from God. Now beyond those themes, we also have attention that we're going to see not only in the book of Exodus, but also in the rest of the Old Testament. And the tension is between God, the people of Israel, and the other nations and their gods throughout the rest of the Old Testament. We're going to see God calling the people of Israel to be loyal to Him and to obey Him, and to reflect His goodness to the rest of the world. But we're also going to see Israel being drawn to mimic the other nations and worship their gods in ways that run contrary to what God's expectations are for His people. And then of course that creates conflict between Israelites, God, and the gods of the other nations. That's the divine love triangle of the Old Testament, if you will. Now, as far as the book of Exodus goes, although it is a very long book, its structure is really straightforward. Exodus is 40 chapters long, and the first half deals with God rescuing the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And the second half deals with how God forms a new relationship with the people of Israel in the wilderness. It's pretty easy to remember because the rescue story goes from chapter 1 to 19, and the relationship story is chapters 20 to 40. So just remember the second half starts at 20 and runs to 40. Then you have a pretty good idea of the general arc of Exodus. And then once you get into that second half, there is some interesting parallelism happening there on which we will get into in just a moment. Let's start with the first half now. The first half opens with prologue. If you remember in Genesis, the people of Israel, which was a small family group, moved to Egypt during a famine because one of Jacob's or Israel's son was a leader in Egypt who was found a way to store food and save a lot of lives because of it. So Israel moves down to Egypt, and they are honored guests, but a couple generations later, the Pharaoh Egypt says, "I don't remember Joseph. I don't know what these Israelites are going here, but they're sure for a lot of them. So let's enslave them and then kill all their baby boys so that they can't rise up and against us. It is a not nice guy, but there's one baby that escapes this genocide, and that is Moses. You probably heard the story of how Moses' mother put him in a basket and set him adrift in a river. And then he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. Well, that plays out in the second chapter of Exodus. So Moses escapes this genocide, and then he grows and he sees some of the Israelites being mistreated. So he tries to save the Israelites on his own. It doesn't go so well, and Moses is exiled in that second chapter. But that's really just the opening story, because in the second section, God calls Moses in the wilderness and he sends him to the people of Israel. He says, go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. It is a very famous line from the Bible. And Moses does what he goes to Egypt and he tells Pharaoh to let his people go. Now Pharaoh doesn't just give in right away. So God sends a series of 10 plagues on the Egyptians. Now this is really an interesting part of the Bible, because God says that he is going to be executing judgment on Pharaoh and the other gods of Egypt. The Egyptians considered Pharaoh, their king, to be a god himself. God says that Pharaoh has taken Israel hostage and God wants to bring Israel back. God talks about Israel as his firstborn son. And so Pharaoh has God's sons. God is fighting Pharaoh and the other gods of Egypt to get his family back to rescue Israel. So that's going on with these 10 plagues. And God ends up overpowering Pharaoh and the other gods of Egypt and allowing Israel to go free. And so we have that really dramatic sequence of Israel walking through the Red Sea. God parts the water so those chaotic waters and the people of Israel come through safely to the other side. And then God meets the people of Israel in the wilderness. God is on a mountaintop and the people are down below. That's where the first half of Exodus ends. Now, while the first half of Exodus ended with 10 plagues, the second half of Exodus opens with 10 commandments. Another very famous story passage in the Bible, and it's interesting because God gives these 10 commandments to the people from the mountaintop. What's happening in here is that God is giving his laws to his people and he's initiating what we call a covenant. Now a covenant is like a treaty. God is saying, I'm gonna be your God and you're gonna be my people. And then I have expectations for my people, and if you keep them, you will get my blessings. And if you don't, then I'm going to discipline you. And so that's what God is doing when He's laying out those 10 commandments. And at the end of giving some details around those commandments, Israel agrees. They say, everything the Lord has spoken, we will do, and so it is a done deal. God says, great. So now I'm going to, because I am your God, I am going to give you way to meet with you. I am going to come and dwell in your midst. And so He gives Moses plans to make a portable template, which is called a tabernacle. So it's a tent that they would carry around with them in the wilderness. And this was a holy place. This was a place where the divine realm and the physical realm could meet. It is a place where God could meet His people. And so very exciting that God is giving Moses plans to make this place for him, to meet with his people. But once those plans are done, Moses comes down the mountain and sees Israel worshiping another God. So well, in the first part of this section, God made laws. In the next part, we see Israel breaking those laws. They were breaking the first two of those 10 commandments. And at the end of giving some details around those commandments, I'm going to come and dwell in your midst. And so he gives Moses plans to make a portable template, which is called a tabernacle. So it's a tent that they could carry around with them in the wilderness. This is a holy place. This is a place where the divine realm and the physical realm could meet. It is a place where God could meet his people. And so, very exciting, God is giving Moses to make his place for him to meet with his people. But once those plans are done, Moses comes down the mountaintop and sees Israel worshiping another God. So well, in the first part of this section, God made laws. In the next part, we see Israel breaking those laws. They were breaking the first two of those 10 commandments right off the bat, and that doesn't go so well for the people, but God gives them a second chance. By doing that, the people are actually able to build the tabernacle. And God does not come down from the mountain and fill the tent. He fills it with his glory. We see that pillar of cloud move down and the rest on top of a tent. And feel that holy place, there's a problem. Nobody can go in. Nobody can go into this tabernacle. Not even Moses can enter. So what do you want to do when you have a very, very powerful being living in your presence and no one can approach him directly well? And that's what the next book of the Bible is all about. That's the book of Leviticus, and we will be discussing next week. Hope to see you again next week as we continue this series, The Bible. Have a wonderful week ahead. God bless everyone. Know that we love you.